I'm Michael Levine Clark, University of Denver, with John McDonald from EBSCO and Jason Price from Scalc. And we want to talk about Unsub, which is a tool that I think has been making quite a bit of a splash in libraries. It's a tool that can help us understand the implications of breaking apart a big deal and going to title by title selection. It's a powerful tool. It's a tool that I think everybody should be paying attention to, but it's a tool that you need to understand how to use. When you first start using Unsub and load your JR1 and start looking at your usage data and looking at the suggestions for what you can do, the first thought is, oh my God, we can save a lot of money. Because right out of the box, for this particular library, with their JR1 loaded and their usage data in place, they can get 70% instant fulfillment for $173,000, which seems pretty amazing. They can get 80% instant fulfillment for $462,000 by subscribing to 96 titles, and they can pay just 19.9% of the big deal cost. Oh my God, we can save a lot of money. But it's actually too good to be true. You can't actually save that much money because some of the assumptions need to be changed and challenged. One of these in particular is that the backfile is available as 100% perpetual access. And that's not true for Elsevier for most of us, if not any of us. So that's one example of things that need to be changed. And we're going to talk through some of the assumptions behind Unsub and some of the things that librarians can change in the parameters to adjust those assumptions.
So what is Unsub? It's a data dashboard that predicts the impact of unbundling by comparing the cost and access profiles, which we've just seen a bit of, to the library design title by title scenarios. And it compares those to the package status quo. How does it work? It models demand based on citation, authorship, and local and global usage patterns, and compares that demand to availability based on open access, post-cancellation, and subscription rights. Most importantly, for the focus of our study, it allows libraries and librarians to configure these factors in ways that reflect their situation, values, and desired outcome. So some basics, it's priced affordably at about $1,000 per library per year, currently covers Elsevier, Wiley, and Springer Nature collections. It is the libraries input their most recent standard counter report. Support for counter 5 in Unsub is due out shortly. So that is going to be added soon as well. And in cases where a library doesn't have comprehensive post-cancellation access, they also need to upload their subscribed title or post-cancellation access list. The system then returns a ranked list of recommended titles based on their value according to those underlying parameters. All the title data is exportable, some by a standard export, others require more of a cut and paste approach, but there's a lot of great data that's available that's gathered together for libraries through this product, and it's worth thinking more about how libraries can learn from and use that data. So our approach was one of exploration and comparison. We'll share results based on examination of 5 institutions, 2 R2s or doctoral institutions with high research activity, 2 R1s, doctoral institutions with a very high research activity, and 1 medical school. In the end, we decided to limit our examples to the Elsevier package for the sake of simplicity. And today, today's agenda, we'll walk you through, each of us will walk you through one of 3 sections that address Unsub's definitions and terminology, configurable parameters, and embedded assumptions. So as an overview of round 1, I'll describe Unsub's use of demand as a lens for percent availability, then turn to the impact of Unsub's definition of usage, which is expanded to include citations and authorships, as well as the impact of its definition of value, which excludes usage of content that's freely available or has already been paid for. Then I'll round it out with a critical examination of Unsub's fulfillment terminology, wherein I found delayed and instant as terms to be quite misleading. Thinking of the journal article at the most basic level, and journal article availability at the most basic level, the creators of Unsub found about 25% of articles with DOI were available in some form of open access. But then in the bottom half of this figure, when they took a sample based on those DOIs that users actually requested over time, or the same period of time, the percent of those that were open was nearly 50%. Thus, they point out that actually looking at open access availability based on demand is the more important measure when evaluating the level of access users actually experience. The mathemagic of Unsub requires taking this to the next level, looking at it over time. So these are using figures from papers published by Unsub's creators, POR and Preem. We can see that at the left, a figure that represents availability by year of publication, which will differ markedly for each journal, depending on the proportion of its articles that are available to users via open access or subscription / post-cancellation rights. The gray or paywalled portion would flip to subscribed or post-cancellation access for subscribed journals, and then might reappear year by year when a subscription is canceled. And this picture is altered journal by journal based on the parameters as you adjust them in Unsub. The brilliance of Unsub is that it then combines this institution-specific article availability by journal, shown on the left, with each journal's pattern of demand or downloads, also by year of publication on the right. This curve would also vary markedly, does, by journal, being less steep in disciplines like math or social sciences, where older articles are more likely to be relevant to the reader. But it doesn't stop there. Unsub then uses the data representing the past 10 years, here highlighted in red, to predict the fulfillment based on future availability in light of that demand. So they measure, and they do this down below by measuring the proportion of views on the y-axis by the year of view on the x-axis, which you can see is projected 5 years into the future. And yes, for each individual journal. This is a total mind bender. So if you find it hard to comprehend, you are not alone. In fact, in conversations with creators and authors in the past, they've said it was totally a mind bender for them and still often is. But the take-home point is to keep in mind is that when using Unsub is that the availability percentages you're looking at are based on demand rather than based just on the percentage of published articles available. So then turning to Unsub's definition of journal usage, we all know that the canonical definition of journal usage is its number of full text article views, or more colloquially, its number of downloads. Unsub expands this definition by including data on local citations and articles authored with adjustable multipliers to determine the strength of their influence on that broader measure of usage. We wanted to know how different this measure of usage would be from the traditional one. So we created scatter plots to look at the strength of a relationship between traditional usage here on the x-axis and Unsub's default definition, expanded definition of usage on the y-axis. In this case, more than 98% of the variation in the expanded definition on the y-axis is explained by variation in standard usage. So they are quite similar. This strong relationship held up for all 5 institutions, with traditional usage explaining 95 to 99% of the variation, in this expanded definition of usage. Since the expanded definition might have occasional important effects on the rank of subscribed titles, and thus which ones are recommended, we have used their expanded default definition throughout these analyses and suggest there's no harm or undue influence from libraries doing the same. Next, we turn to Unsub's definition of journal value, which expands on traditional cost per use by removing the usage that's available by open access or post-cancellation rights from the cost per use denominator. So as a result, the cost per paid use metric will always be higher, greater than or equal to traditional cost per use, as you can see here, given the slight shift of the line to the left. And the strength of this relationship, which I haven't shown in the figures, is not quite as strong. The highest was this one, around 90% of the variation, but it ranged from about 60 to 90% across our institutions. More importantly, to get a better sense of the variation, the rest of these traditional cost per use versus cost per paid use comparisons are plotted on a log scale, and they focus on the lowest cost per use or highest value titles, since these are the ones that are most likely to be maintained or retained. So the fundamental question that Unsub addresses is, which title should we keep? And as an important aside, it does not directly address how many titles a library should keep, although that is a much more difficult question. On the left, the orange dots represent a set of 76 titles that a library might keep solely based on ranking by traditional cost per use. Here, it's those journals with a traditional cost per use under $9. We can compare that to the set of 76 journals that have the highest value in Unsub, here shown on the right in blue, and that is those with a cost per paid use under $11. When we overlay these two sets, we can see that they have 56 titles in common, shown in black. These are the highest value titles under either measure. But what's more interesting is the sets of 20 titles that differ based on the different definitions of cost per use. So for this institution that decided to keep a third of its subscribed titles, 1/4 of those titles that Unsub recommends in blue are different from those that a decision based solely on traditional cost per use would select first, shown in orange. Looking at the impact of this across the other institutions seeking to maintain the same level of access, we can see that the degree was similar. Between 1/4 and 1/7 of the set of recommended titles are different when using the cost per paid use definition that Unsub bases its recommendations on. Moving on to terminology, we really had an issue with delayed fulfillment as a term. In this scenario, a library saves 2/3 of its annual big deal cost, shown in the stacked bar on the left, and in the result to the right, is that 1/3 of the article requests fall into the ILL or delayed fulfillment category, since they're not available by open access, backfile, or subscription rights. While this might sound harmless enough, Unsub defines delayed access as cases that require asking the author for a paper, asking a colleague, or finding another similar paper that is good enough for their purposes, etc. That sounds like lost access to me. Furthermore, since only 5% of the quote ILL/delayed access unquote results in ILL requests, 95% of the articles in that section are not delivered. That is, they're really turnaways. While the turnaway to ILL percentage is configurable in the model, libraries are likely to be hard-pressed to change this percentage in reality. So for the purposes of illustration, we relabeled this bar to better reflect reality, showing 2% of the access is ILL or delayed, and 32% is turned away. In other words, these savings do come at a cost. Now let's turn to the other end of the fulfillment wire, to the open access portion of instant fulfillment. We argue that it's dubious to refer to all of open access as providing instant fulfillment, since that would require instant seamless access to content not hosted on the publisher site. That's because by default, the open access measured in Unsub includes green OA and unpeer-reviewed preprints and rogue OA that is on ResearchGate and other non-OA repositories. If every user had the unpaywall plugin installed, then perhaps we might approach this level of access to some version of the article, but certainly that's far from our current reality. So to get a sense of the impact of alternative or external versions on instant fulfillment, we can estimate the proportion of the articles on the publisher site versus versions that are hosted elsewhere and might not be linked or acceptable copies. Since the fulfillment settings in Unsub don't allow us to distinguish between hybrid and green peer-reviewed OA, we have to guesstimate that 15 or more % of the 66 percentage points represented in instant fulfillment fall in this category. That's nearly a quarter of the instant fulfillment that may be likely to go unfulfilled. So putting these adjustments to delayed and instant fulfillment terminology together, we argue that a more conservative perspective would see this scenario as providing 50% fulfillment at 35% of the cost, rather than the 100% fulfillment suggested by the standard stacked bar graph and its terminology. And with that, I'll hand it over to Michael for round 2.
Thanks, Jason. So I'm going to talk about the configurable parameters. One of the things that is really great about Unsub is that you can actually adjust all of the parameters, or many of the parameters, allowing you to test assumptions and to take into account some of the things that Jason's talked about. So the parameters fall into 4 broad categories around cost, interlibrary loan, fulfillment sources, which covers both open access and perpetual access, backfile access, and then citation and authorship. And I'll talk through each of those. So first of all, costs. The costs are important to adjust. The standard default big deal cost for all of the packages in Unsub is 2.1 million, but libraries often pay less than that, or considerably less than that in the case of this example, where a library pays a little over 700,000 for their big deal. Big deal growth is the default is set at 5%. It varies quite a bit, and the actual might be lower than that based on whatever you've negotiated with a publisher. A la carte subscription cost growth is based on, or the assumption is based on the idea that if you switch to title by title, you would not be paying the big deal growth rate, but you'd be paying a higher annual cost. We've just left that as is. And the a la carte content fee with Elsevier is not 5.7%, which is the standard. It's actually 25%. So we've adjusted these, and then we've sort of looked through to see what the impact is. So going from 5.7% to 25% on the a la carte content fee, going from 5% big deal growth down to a lower actual rate for each of our 5 institutions, and then plugging in the actual big deal cost gives a truer sense of what the subscription cost would be if a library were to break up its big deal and go title by title. At the true cost, with 66% instant fulfillment across these institutions, there's roughly 18% increase in cost compared to the default settings. So let's go into that in a little bit more detail. This is one of these institutions. This is one of the R2 institutions their big deal cost is a little under 7 million. With the default 5% big deal growth and the 5.7% content fee in place, you can see that this institution would get 66% instant fulfillment, and by paying $258,000, they'd be paying just under 34% of their big deal cost. By adjusting those numbers upwards for the content fee and downwards for the big deal growth rate, you can see that those same 116 subscriptions would cost $305,000. So there's a significant change there based on the parameters that you have in place for cost. And that goes from 34% of the big deal up to 42% of the big deal cost. Across these 5 institutions, the pattern holds, right? So the first row is with the standard numbers in place, and this is the percentage of the big deal cost that they would be paying. In the second row, it's the percentage of the big deal cost they'd be paying if they put in if they change the defaults. There's a relative cost difference that is relatively small for some of these institutions. So $15,000 doesn't sound like a lot, but it does all add up. And you can see that the percentage cost difference between these across these institutions is roughly 18%. The second set of parameters is related to interlibrary loan. And Jason talked about sort of the philosophical issues with the interlibrary loan decision. And I'll just say that you can change the parameters. You can change to the true interlibrary loan transaction cost. You can adjust the interlibrary loan frequency, but you can't necessarily control user behavior to make the interlibrary loan frequency go up or go down, right? So this is not something that we can necessarily change, but it's something that we need to think about as we make decisions about moving away from a big deal and providing decreased access to content. The parameters around fulfillment sources are complex and important, and I'll talk through these in some depth. The first 3 of these are around open access availability. So whether or not to include bronze open access, essentially these are toggles. You can toggle on or off the availability of bronze open access in your calculations. You can toggle on or off non-peer-reviewed versions of the article. So green open access that has not been peer-reviewed, whether you want to include that or not. And you can include the ResearchGate hosted content or not as well. And we've chosen to toggle all of those off just to see what's available. And we've also toggled off in this example the availability of perpetual access backfile content. With all of those toggled off, there's still 15 to 25% availability of open access content. And this breaks down into hybrid and green open access that would not meet that non-peer-reviewed definition. So there is some open access available even if you toggle these things off. And then we started to toggle them back on to see what the numbers are. You can see that if we include bronze, it adds from 3 to 6% more content. And ResearchGate stacked on top of that adds somewhere between 4 and 8%. And then the non-peer-reviewed adds somewhere from 5 to 8%. And you can think about whether you want to include all or some or none of these in your calculations. We've chosen to exclude the non-peer-reviewed in most of our calculations because we feel like somebody might be willing to use non-peer-reviewed content, but to rely on it seems like something we'd rather not do. But a different library might choose to exclude the ResearchGate or even some of these other categories from their calculations. The next set of fulfillment sources are whether or not to include perpetual access, or I should say how to include perpetual access. So the default, as I already mentioned, is 100% backfile perpetual access, which is not true for Elsevier, though it is true for some other publishers. You can change that to any percentage you want. So you could adjust the perpetual access to a percentage based on your actual title list. You can also toggle off that include perpetual access and just turn it off and say you don't want to include any. Or you can upload a custom backfile, which is what we recommend. So once you upload a custom backfile, a title list of things that you do have perpetual access rights to in your setup, it grays out that bottom parameter and lists partial. And that is what we would recommend everybody do, because this is the difference. So if you include the perpetual access as 100%, it assumes that you have somewhere between 30 and 40% access to the backfile right up front. For the backfile as percentage, based on the title count, where you assign a percentage, it's a very low amount available when you do your calculations. And then when you do your uploaded backfile, it's somewhere in between those two. So what happens when you start to play around with the system and build on this? We can see that with those settings in place, we have roughly 45 to 50% availability of open access and backfile in the beginning. And then for these libraries, we asked what would happen if we wanted to get to 66% instant access. Using that 25% standard Elsevier a la carte content fee, if you were to go to a title by title subscription and break up your big deal. The number of titles needed is between 55 and 158 for these institutions. The percentage of those existing subscribed title lists for each of those institutions ranges from 27 to 61%. And then their subscription cost varies from $99,000 for the medical school up to almost $500,000 for each of the R1s. But you can see that all of these are paying only a fraction of their big deal cost, ranging from 14 to 44%. It seems like a pretty good deal, right? So let's try to get more access at these institutions. We go up to 75%. And the numbers go up. And in fact, for the second R2, they actually would need to subscribe to more titles than they currently subscribe to, because the titles that they're subscribing to are probably just the wrong list of titles, and they're not high use titles. And they're more expensive titles than the actual titles that get used at that institution. But you can see at the bottom, the number that probably matters the most, what percentage of the big deal cost would you be paying to get to your desired instant access, in this case, 75%. And 92% and 71% for the R2s might be getting to the point where the value of canceling the big deal and moving to title by title doesn't really come into play when you consider how much access you're going to lose compared to the R1s and the medical, where it might be a better decision. The final set of parameters is around citation and authorship. Jason talked through the sort of enhanced concept of usage that Unsub uses that takes into account institutional citations and institutional authorship, which are weighted at 10 downloads per citation and 100 downloads per authorship. You can adjust those if you want or not. It doesn't affect the instant fulfillment calculations, but it could very well affect the titles that you choose to add if you were going to go to a title by title subscription. Just in this example, you can see that this particular title, when we remove that parameter, goes from number 1 on a particular institution's list of titles in terms of cost per use down to number 65 in terms of cost per use. And you can see the weighted overall uses right in the center of each of those tables. In the first one, where it's 2,821 overall uses, it's taking into account citations and authorships. And in the second one, it's subtracted those and it's just counting downloads. These are all things that are worth playing with and understanding, and really having a clear understanding of what these mean in terms of how you calculate your value so that you can make informed decisions when you're moving from a big deal to title by title subscription. And now I'm going to turn it over to John.
Thanks, Michael. So my part of the presentation was to really dig into the usage assumptions around the backfile. So Unsub does consider the front file to be everything in the past 10 years. So current 2020 publications back to 2011. And then the back file is everything from 2010 prior back to version 1. And our understanding is the back file usage has been deemed not of significant enough volume to really affect calculations in Unsub as you're using the tool. So we just wanted to better understand that. So we dove into a couple of the assumptions. These are all published on Unsub's webpage in the help files or about Unsub. The first one being that that they actually determine the usage by age of publication from the unpaywall browser extension. And we wondered if that was representative of all users in all institutions. And so we were going to look at our 5 institutions and see how that affected it by analyzing JR5 reports rather than JR1 and then supplementing it with the unpaywall backfile usage assumptions. Then the second is that they state that it's true that interest in a journal may vary across universities. The relative interest of older versus newer papers within a given journal doesn't. So we want to look at that. Third, their analysis for the backfile works well even for low usage journals and for small schools. We'll look into that. And then they state that they can correlate year of publication usage with green OA. And we wondered if that varied by institution and by discipline. So just for fun, we're using the Snopes.com true, mostly true, mixture, and false. So first on that first one, does that unpaywall browser extension usage really reflect all users in all institutions? So what we did was we pulled in those JR5s, which is the usage in we used 2019 files for all 5 of our institutions. And so what JR5 does is it divides out usage by year of publication of the article being used. So these are all uses in 2019 and then charted by the year of use. And we went back to 2000 on this one. So the backfile is 2010 and earlier. And you can see that generally the shape of the curves is about the same. To normalize the data, we used a percentage of total use by year of use. And you can see in our gray line up here is our medical school, and then the yellow line is one of our R1s. And generally they follow the same pattern, very heavy current use tailing off into the long tail. The other 3 institutions, especially the 2 R2s, have much lower levels of current use, but then they tail off just the same as others. But what we want to point out is that the usage of the backfile overall, still, these are big numbers. So we're looking at, for the 1 R1, 250,000 articles in 1 year were used from the backfile. For the other R1, nearly 200,000, and then down to our R2s, right around the 50,000 mark. And then in the table there, that's the percentage of total use. So we're still ranging, even for a medical school, between 24% all the way up to an R2 that has comprehensive programs across the social sciences and arts and humanities as well, up to 35%. So these numbers are big. So our determination here is that usage of the backfile does vary based on the research focus of the institution, but really not as much as we expected. So our determination on this one was mostly true. Now we're looking at the relative interest in older versus newer papers. And what Unsub is doing is taking a huge data set, millions and millions of transactions, and aggregating them up at a high level. And so we just wanted to unpack that a little bit and look at, within an institution, does the interest in older versus newer papers change year over year? So what we looked at was rank order correlations of these journals by institution for interest in the current year versus the previous year. That's in the first column. The current year versus 2 years ago, and then the current year versus 5 years ago. And as you can see from these Pearson correlation coefficients circled at the top here for our two R1s, generally they're right. So big institutions with a lot of usage, the order of popularity of their journals doesn't actually really change all that much. But then for the other ones, and surprising to us, the medical school as well, the interest in older versus newer articles by journal actually does fluctuate quite a bit. So our determination on this one is that interest in a journal does vary year to year within that institution, and it's dependent really on institutional size and research focus. So our determination is sort of a mixture. So, for the big institutions with a lot of usage, it probably does work pretty well. For smaller ones, maybe not so much. Now, we wanted to look at the statement about low usage journals in small schools. But first, we actually didn't have enough time, and we couldn't come up with a way to look at the low usage journals. So we're going to exclude that analysis right now from this part of the presentation. But we did look at the small schools. So we have just a couple of tables here, descriptive statistics, added up all the usage of the front file and usage of the back file. And again, you can see these ranges are pretty wide, and the numbers are really big. But interestingly enough, because these schools have a different kind of disciplinary focus, we looked at in table 3 the backfile usage by broad subject and institution. And so all we really did here was assign usage to a journal, whether it fell into the Science Citation Index, Social Science Citation Index, or Arts and Humanities Index. And what you can see here is that the total numbers are pretty high overall, and that essentially arts and humanities usage, particularly for an Elsevier package, is very low. But you could see that if you're going to start analyzing other publishers who have more of a focus in that area, you're going to want to take that into account. But even the backfile usage, even of things that fall into the social sciences, is still relatively big, even at like a medical school, for example, where they use 13,000 articles in that 1 year, or 9% of their usage fell into this other discipline that you might not expect. And then when you get down to the R2s, the usage of the backfile, at least between the sciences and social sciences, is roughly at 50% or so. So we determined for this one that interest in the backfile does vary by size of school and the research focus of that institution. So our determination was that this is primarily false. Now, we also wanted to look at this idea of correlating the year of publication usage with green OA. The same table from the previous slide with table 3, backfile usage by subject area, or broad discipline, I should say. What we did was we took those numbers and we actually divided them out by journal and applied the percentage of open access availability to the backfile versus the front file. And so we did use some research by Eric Archambault at One Science around percentages of open access availability year to year, and then compiled that into our 3 different categories. And as you can see, the front file, so the last 10 years, much more open access is being published in all of these areas, quite surprisingly in the social sciences, probably because that's driven by a lot of the economics repositories. But the backfile OA percentage is much less for the backfile. So you're not going to find as much backfile open access in the backfile. So applying that together to table 5, you see that we came up with a total number and a percentage of the total paywalled articles not provided that these institutions otherwise used. And they do range from 15% at the medical school all the way up to I can't see the screen anymore, all the way up to 22% at the R2. So our determination on this one is that we determine that backfile usage does vary by size of school and research focus, and you have to layer on some percentage of OA availability by year of publication and discipline. So again, this is a mixture. So you can correlate publication usage with green OA as well. That's possible, but you do need to apply it to your model. So in summary, we have a couple of take-home points. One, Unsub as a tool is absolutely fantastic, and this is something libraries need. This type of data wasn't available previously, and so you were really taking a shot in the dark about, renegotiating your big deal, whether it was valuable, what the aspects of the big deal were that were providing value to your institution, but you just need to use it strategically. And then you might wonder about some of the terminology. Again, delayed, instant, free, are you okay with that as an institution? Moving that burden of provision of content off to other institutions or back onto the users in order for them to find OA out there on the open web. Again, cost backfile and OA parameters are crucial. Both Jason and Michael pointed that out. But you really need to be accurate with them, and so there is some work on the library side to determine what those things are. What backfile do you have? How much do your things cost? What is the open access availability estimated at? And again, as librarians, we all know ILL is problematic for as a substitute for licensed or open access. It's only 5%, in some studies, only 5% of turnaways turn into ILL requests. So you have to be okay with that. And then some provocative questions, and we'll get into to the Q&A portion. So, is your job to provide content access, and how do you balance that with the budget constraints that you're all working under? Is it okay to exclude use of content that's already been paid for, especially when publishers may be using backfile as a negotiating point for you continuing the big deal? And then again, do you trust a tool, or can you trust a tool that would reflect your institution and your users when you know that there are variations? Not every single library is a special snowflake, but there are clear differences between R1s and R2s and all the other Carnegie classifications. So you really have to take those into account. So back to you, Michael, if you want to start on the Q&A.
Sure. Yeah. So we've gone over, but we are happy to stay here for a little bit and answer questions. We will, and of course, this is being recorded, so you can, if you do need to step off, these will be available for you, and we'll make sure that we make the slides available as well. Jason, have you noticed any questions that you wanted to jump on?
Sure. So, I mean, the one initial question was, can you explain the content fee more, and where did the 25% come from? Content fee is a concept that I believe is unique to Elsevier, or at least it's relatively unusual, which is they charge a premium percentage on top of the list price if you're not in a package deal. And so the 25% came from correspondence with Elsevier to confirm that what was their typical content fee outside of the package in the past is still the default content fee. Now, obviously, this can potentially be negotiated with Elsevier, but 25% is the number that they at least start from.
Yeah, and our assumption is that if you're moving away from a big deal, you have to sort of reset all of your discounts and all of your numbers and go back more toward whatever the standard numbers are. I've had several questions about how we're about posting the slides, and we will make sure that we do post the slides soon.
Post cancellation access and managing that and the difficulty of doing it, that's kind of a nuanced thing. It is less important in cases where terms with a publisher include access to the entire amount of the entire set of articles published in each year that you participate. So typically the database model, as we often refer to it, includes all of that. And Unsub does take it into account just going back to 2011. So for those other publishers where that post-cancellation access is comprehensive, this doesn't really affect them. But to our knowledge, for most Elsevier agreements, people only have post-cancellation access to their subscribed title list. And so they do need to track what that access is from 2011 going forward. And those title lists can come from reports that Elsevier provides. Some of that is delivered on an annual basis, but it is not necessarily an easy thing to do. But because of the dramatic impact it does clearly have on the proportion of instant access, we argue that it is very important and worth the effort. But really do note that you don't have to track it before 2011 because the model doesn't take it into account. And Unsub makes that clear in their documentation.
Right, and when you upload that report, you can actually just create it by using title, ISSN, and then a start date and an end date for your backfile access. And the start date can just be the beginning of 2011. There's a comment about interlibrary loan and about the idea that libraries can make a decision to really encourage interlibrary loan, and I absolutely agree with that. One of the things we did model was 100% interlibrary loan fulfillment at $35, with the idea that what would happen if you were going to do if you were going to encourage and cover the costs for unmediated document delivery, and it came to 5.1 million for the institution we modeled it on. But you could certainly start to think through what would happen if we really were trying to make it easier to do interlibrary loan at an institution. But I think fundamentally that requires you to have systems in place that allow the user to go directly from whatever they happen to find to the full text of that article without having to know enough to request something through interlibrary loan.
And certainly one huge question is how important is those cases where someone doesn't get the original article that they clicked on to try to read. And that's going to vary by institution, I think. If it's a primarily undergraduate institution and those articles are just for a paper but not for primary research, then switching to another article may be totally fine, and it might be much more acceptable to have a higher proportion of those requests turned away. In other cases, I don't think we know what is the cost of somebody who's trying to do research saying, oh, here's the article I want, and then if they give up for whatever reason, rather than request it from ILL, what's the cost of that? And it's not really an answerable question, but I think it's something that we kind of have to address here. I do want to make sure it's clear that the kinds of access that you include really are up to you. You can go in and say, I don't want to include any ResearchGate content, or I don't want to include any preprints that haven't been pre-reviewed. You have those options. For us, the message is you should think about those options. You should agree as a library what is and isn't kind of acceptable in terms of considering it as equivalent access as you interpret the outcome of the model. probably just have another couple minutes. I don't know, John or Michael, other things you saw.
So there's a question about transformative deals and how to think about those in terms of this kind of analysis. And it's a great question, and it's one that I'm sort of trying to wrap my head around. What I would say, I guess, is that so everything that you're doing with this is based on past usage patterns and on existing current open access availability. And the idea with a transformative deal, of course, is that you're going to ultimately increase the open access availability, right? So it's hard to think through how that would be calculated. It would be beautiful to have a system where you could plug in the transformative elements of a particular deal and help that with the calculation. But that's sort of, I'm not even sure how I would think about doing that. But it's a good question that I don't have a good answer to.
Someone asked how Unsub determines open access and post-cancellation availability for a given title. The open access portion is based on users of on paywall. So there's a browser that they have created, browser extension they've created that there's 250 million users of, if that number is right. And it basically, they find out what people request, and then when they request it, that returns those results based on a database that they've built of the availability of those articles. So they're able to actually determine the relevant OA availability. And then the post-cancellation access piece, that's up to you to make sure it's accurate. And we really think that it's crucial that that be done, because it can change the model by half or close to that if you don't accurately represent it. So that you upload a file that has a list of titles, and that then you're representing, here's what my post-cancellation access is.
So John and I have another presentation to give in five minutes.
Yeah.
So we probably need to go. But the recording will be available. We are happy to follow up if you want to connect to us by email or reach out through the conference. And we will make sure that we get the slides out to be shared on the conference website. And I know we've gotten a couple of private chats and emails about sharing them, and we'll make sure we do that as well.
Thanks, everybody. Thanks for your attention.
Thank you.
Thank you.